Guys, welcome to History with Robin. We are going to be talking a little bit about a time period called the Industrial Revolution, which maybe you know a little bit about from your study before, but if not, I'll explain what we're talking about. So thank you all for joining me. And let's just see, I think we're gonna get started very soon. Hi guys, thank you everybody for joining me. I'm sure, hi Cypress, hi Ellie. Okay, so I think we are gonna get started. And we are going to talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so let me start my slideshow. Okay, so I'll explain, Aletta. Okay, so back in 1750, which was about 30 years before the American Revolution, another revolution was getting started, and it was called the Industrial Revolution. And this was actually not a war like the American Revolution was. Revolution also means a big change in the way things are done. And the Industrial Revolution was a big change in industry. And when we talk about industry, we mean the way people did work and made things. So factories, different ways of making things are all part of industry. And being industrious means to get a lot of things done. So this revolution made it possible for people to be more industrious and get a lot more done more easily. And we're going to talk about some of the ways that that happened. Thank you, Alette, for reminding me how to pronounce your name. My costume is a woman who would have worked in one of the factories that we're going to talk about. We may not talk about this exact factory, but in Massachusetts, there was a factory called the Lowell Factory, and it was a system of factories, and they employed women to work the different machines. Great question. Lily, where are you? Behind you? This behind me is a picture of the Brooklyn Bridge being built. And it just is I chose that one because it shows that a lot of things were getting done and new and exciting things were being built. So this is a picture of when the Brooklyn Bridge was being built. Okay, so one of the ways in the Industrial Revolution where they made it easier for people to do more work was they started inventing a lot better machines. And before that, people did have machines, but they were mostly simple machines. In fact, these days we call the things they have simple machines, and they were very helpful in getting things done. Now, there are some different simple machines. There are wedges, wheels, and axles, the thing that the wheel turns on, levers, ramps, screws, and pulleys. And those were all things which helped people do work. You're right, the wheel and axle is one of them. You know, if you wanted to, like, say the lever, like the red thing in the middle, if you want to pick up a big heavy rock and you can't pick it up yourself, then you could put part of the lever under it and push down over this little middle part called the fulcrum and use it to lift it up. The wedges, great question, Caroline. What did the wedge do? Have you ever seen anybody chopping wood like a big, huge log. Sometimes with your axe, you can chop it in half. But if it's so big, if it's a really big piece, you can actually put a wedge in it and hit the end of the wedge, and that creates a crack. So then you can chop it into smaller pieces. So they would use that to break things apart. The last thing on the picture is called a pulley system. So what you do is you wrap the ropes around that round thing, the pulley, and then it can actually multiply your strength. So you could use that to make it easier to pull up something that's really heavy. Andrew, no problem being late. We are talking about the Industrial Revolution and America. Isha, yes. So the last thing I was talking about is the rope and pulley, which is the last little thing that's on the right. And it is a system where you can wrap ropes around it in a certain way. And it actually makes it easier to pick up heavier things, like the force that you're putting into it gets multiplied in a certain way. So when it can pick up this big rock. Isis, I don't think we're going to talk about the cotton gin, though that would have been a good thing to talk about. We're going to talk about a little bit more the spinning of it. What kind of things were pulleys usually used for? Great question, Lorna. To pick up, heavy objects. Sometimes it's used in different ways, like in ships, to like let down sails or pull sails. It's almost any time you want to use something, they use them on ship. I already said that, on ships a lot, to lift heavy things. Okay, great. So those were simple machines. So to get an idea, and that's what they had for all of the time before the Industrial Revolution. So to get an idea of how the Industrial Revolution started, we're going to look at the history of making cloth. How did all that start? So it actually started thousands of years ago when people started taking care of sheep. Mackenzie and Denali, great question. I am dressed as a woman who works in one of the factories in the Industrial Revolution. So when the summer came, these shepherds, the men who were raising sheep, would trim their sheep's fur to help keep them cold, to help keep them cool. But the shepherds would end up with these big piles of fur, wool, and they wanted to have something that they could do with the wool. So that's a picture when they were done shearing the sheep, that's what they call it. They would have these big piles of wool. So someone invented the way that they could spin the wool into thread, and then they'd be able to use that thread to knit into clothes. Lorna, great question. Did all that wool come out of one shearing? Yes, but it probably was many, many sheep. That probably was 15 or more of the fleeces is what they called them. Of the sheep. So that might be one whole like herd. So they would figure out that they could take that wool and they could turn it into thread, which they could then use to knit clothes like sweaters. But it would take hours for someone to spin enough to make a ball. So if you've ever been to the craft store or you've ever seen anybody knitting or crocheting, you know that they have a ball of yarn that then they're using the knitting needles to turn into cloth. But it would take so many hours to start with the thread, turn it into the wool, to the yarn, and turn it into then a ball. And it would take many, many hours to make enough of the balls of yarn to make a sweater. So to spin enough by hand for a sweater might take 30 hours. And so they needed a better way to be able to do that. Caroline, great question. Do people still make cloth? clothes this way? Yes, I'm sure there are still people who take the wool from sheep and spin it into yarn and then turn that into clothing. And yes, all the wool that, like if you went to the craft store and you bought wool yarn to knit a sweater with, that would be from a sheep. Though now, as we're going to talk about in a little bit, we use machines to do that rather than hand spinning it. So the better way than doing it by hand was something called the spinning wheel. Now, if any of you have seen Sleeping Beauty, you know what a spinning wheel is. That's the thing she pricks her finger on. And historians aren't sure who was the first person to invent the spinning wheel or when it was invented or where. But they guess that it was about 1,000 years ago, and it probably was invented by someone in India or China. And but either way, no matter who, you can see on the picture on the right is a Chinese painting of a woman working a spinning wheel. So instead of using her hands to spin it, she can actually use the wheel and spin it a lot faster. But no matter who invented it or where it was invented, by using the spinning wheel, by spinning it around, they could make enough for a sweater in 10 hours. With this simple machine, they could do the work of 3. So instead of it taking 30 hours to make enough yarn to make a sweater, they could do it in 10 hours. How did they get it to the United States? I'm sure that that technology, that simple machine, people would visit where it was and be really interested in it and then take those ideas back. Lauren, a great question. Why do they say it was somebody from India or China? I think it's just because historians, people who study that, that's where they first saw it. Olivia, we're talking about the Industrial Revolution and some machines that were invented that helped make work easier and faster. And right now we're just talking about the spinning wheel. So the spinning wheel was a great improvement over hand spinning the yarn. But by 1280, the spinning wheel arrived in Europe. And there were still some improvements that continued to be made to it. But still, it took about 10 hours of work on the wheel to get enough for each sweater. And so you can see this picture on the right, that's like, it looks a little bit like that reminds me of Sleeping Beauty. That's an example of someone using a spinning wheel to make thread. So here we're going to jump about 500 years in the future, and in England in 1760, so this is a little bit before the Revolutionary War, they had a lot of sheep and wool, and they were making a lot of clothes from it. And so there was an Englishman whose name was James Hargreaves, who wanted to solve that problem of how long it took to make this yarn to make these clothes. And so he invented something called the spinning jenny. Now, by spinning the wheel, you could make many threads at once, actually up to 80. And one person could now do the work of 80. So if you look at the picture that's on the right, you can see the woman is turning the wheel, and all of these little things that look like corn dogs, I don't have a better explanation of what they look like, but you can see these little dark things there. Those are all things of thread. And so she's actually making 80 pieces of that at once. Ethan, you are right. What you said is I am going to talk about this man who memorized it. When did the spinning wheel appear in Europe? I think it was around 1280. Lorna, I saw you raised your hand, but if you ask me in the Q&A box, I can try to answer your question. So now with this, where they could make many of these threads at once, they could actually do the work of 80. Now someone could make enough thread for a sweater every 8 minutes. So it went from 30 hours to 10 hours to 8 minutes. So that was very industrious, getting a lot of work done. How many pieces does it take to make a sweater? I'm not quite sure, but I'm assuming because we're talking about 80 of them that it might take 80 of them. Great question. Did they use 80 strings most of the time? In the spinning jenny, yes, that was what they could do. They could make 80 what we call spools of the thread. Okay, no worries, Lorna, that it was an accident. Just wanted to make sure I didn't miss your question. So now that being able to do the work of 80, that was only the beginning, because right after that, an Englishman named Richard Arkwright invented something called the spinning frame, which you can see the picture of on the right. Now, this is a machine that could make thread without a human having to even spin the wheel. So with the spinning jenny, someone had to stand there and spin, 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 spin. And this, the spinning frame, made it without a human. And this was because he connected it to a water wheel, which spun around as the river rushed past it. And you can see in the picture on the left, that wheel is the water wheel. Ethan, you're right. That way you could nearly make 8 sweaters worth of yarn in 1 hour. So it was a huge, huge improvement. Okay, so this is the spinning frame. Great. Yes, Caroline, great question. They did have it use the water wheel or some other kind of rushing water to run it. So then they would have, it could just operate by itself. Perfect. So, but the problem with that was now they could only have a factory for making threads where there was water to spin the water wheels. And what if it got really hot where they lived and the river dried up, or it flooded in the spring and there was too much water? So they tried other ways of doing it. They tried using windmills, but that only really worked when the wind blew. So they needed something where, oh, sorry, I went the wrong way, guys, sorry. They needed something where they could spin it automatically, but no one had invented electricity. So now today, we would just plug it into electricity, hook it up to electricity, and then it would run itself. So, but we didn't have that then. So they needed to invent something where they could do it automatically. Could I go back to the other picture, Isis? Oops, that one, so you can see the spinning frame. And you're right, Ethan, that would compare to 10 days nonstop spinning. It's exactly, it's a great increase in their production. Okay. Okay, so here, so they invented something called the steam engine. So what is a steam engine? The idea is simple. So everybody's boiled a pot of water. And when you boil a pot of water, or you put water in a kettle and boil it on the stove, you get steam. So that steam is hot and it expands with a lot of force that can push things around. Have you ever boiled a pot of water with a lid on it and sort of seen the lid popping off to let go a little bit of the steam? I mean, that's my little cartoon there on the right, but I think we've all kind of seen something like that. So if you boiled enough water and you could find a way to channel the steam, you could use that steam to push around different parts of machines. And that is what we call steam power. And so it comes from steam engines. I don't know the exact number of years till electricity, Caroline, but it was still quite a bit. So this idea of steam engines didn't exist until a man named James Watt came around, and he invented them, or he pretty much invented them. But there's a lot to that story. So what do we know about him for sure? We know he was born in Scotland in 1736. In school, he was good at math. His father was a carpenter, so he built things out of wood, and young Watt helped him and learned how to build things. In 1755, when Watt was 19, he traveled to England from Scotland, and he worked as an apprentice with a man who made instruments, different kinds of instruments. And he worked really hard, and he learned a lot during that time, and he became very, very skilled. Scotland, you can see on the map, is the blue part. So there's the country of England, and then on top, there's another country of Scotland, and that's where James Watt was from. So in 1756, Watt returned to Scotland, and he was so good at making instruments that he actually got a job making instruments for a university. And several years later, a professor at that university came to him with a problem to solve. So they had something called the New Common Engine, which was a pump that was powered by steam that the miners used to pump water out from the bottom of their mines. So there were men and children and women who worked in mines, and they'd go deep down into the earth and they'd mine, or they'd get different substances. Some people mine for gold, some people mine for coal to burn for fuel, silver, different things. I'm pretty sure at this time in Scotland, they were mining for coal so that they could use it as an energy source. So, but one of the things that happens is there can sometimes be water in the ground, in the mines, or sometimes they have to use water to soften up the rocks to be able to mine. So there was a problem with there being too much water in the mines, and so they would use this new common engine to pump that water out from the bottom. But it was really slow, and the question that the professor had for him was, could he improve it so that it would really work and it would be effective? So in this picture to the right, you can see the red thing. You can kind of see where the red goes up and fills that little green box. That is actually the steam. And so the steam pushes up this little thing that looks like a bow tie, which causes it to push down on the bottom, which is causing the water, the blue water, to come up out of the mine. So that's the new common engine. So that's the one that they were trying to get him to fix. And what they had is they had a small working model of the new common engine, and Watt studied it and ran tests. And that's actually what that picture, this picture is. And he figured out what was wrong about it, but it took him 2 years to solve that problem and to find a solution. And so in 1765, when he was 29 years old, he solved it. He knew how to fix it. Sorry, just 1 second, guys. So through his new and improved new common engine, it was now it was now good at using steam to pump water. But he couldn't figure out, the engine couldn't make a wheel spin. And that was actually one of the things that the factories needed. Remember the water wheels and the windmills? They wanted to be able to use this engine to spin the wheel. So James Watt decided he was going to work to solve that problem of how they could use the steam engine to move those wheels. So in 1782, he did it. He invented a steam engine that could spin wheels around, which that's what this picture is. That's what this picture is on the bottom. And you can kind of see the red, I think again, is the steam. And using the steam pushes both of those little things that are moving around, which causes the wheel to be able to spin. So he invented that in 1782, and 18 years later, by the 1800s, factories and mills all over England were powered by his steam engine, which is a huge, huge deal. And of all his inventions, he was the most proud of this one. The blue stuff that's coming out of the top, great question. That's some steam that is escaping. So I guess actually maybe the blue in this drawing is the steam. So now people could use machines powered by steam to rapidly make large amounts of thread automatically. But they still had to turn all that thread into cloth by hand. So they had a solution of how to make the thread, but they didn't have the solution of how to make the cloth. So to do this, they had to use a machine called a hand loom. And it was invented about 2,000 years ago, and the ancient Romans brought it to England. And at that time, 2,000 years ago, it was an amazing invention. And you can see that's what this man is doing in this picture to the right, is he's using a hand loom. Oh, sorry, I went the wrong way again. He's using a hand loom. And what would happen is you would put the threads through all these other threads that are there, and then you'd have to pull them down. And by doing that and going back and forth, it's kind of like weaving. If you've ever done a project weaving at school, where you have threads coming down this way, and then you weave the fabric, the other thread in between it, pull it down, weave it, come this way, pull it down, and eventually that turns into cloth. But you can imagine that took a long time, and at a time when they were able to spin so much thread, it was just way too slow. I think you guys have a couple questions, so hold on one. Oh, so I'm glad, Hadia, that you find my webinars interesting. And I'm dressed as a woman, Aubrey, who's working in one of those factories during the Industrial Revolution. So they had to find a better and faster way. So in 1785, an Englishman named Edmund Cartwright invented a way to connect the power of the steam engine to the loom that made the cloth. And he called it the Power Loom. And that's what you can see a picture of now. So you can see the wheels, and what would happen is the wheels would spin, and it would do all of that thing that I just sort of badly showed you before about weaving the thread in and out, pulling it down, weaving the thread in and out, and pulling it down. So finally, you can see here's all the thread towards the back, and the smooth white thing at the front is actually the cloth that they made. So they were able to make large amounts of cloth very, very, very quickly. Caroline, they're actually looking at it because it was this new invention. Sometimes they would have exhibitions where they would show off these new inventions and promote them and make them well known. And I think that that is a picture of that. So now with this new invention of the Power Loom, now they could build big factories that were full of machines that made the thread and then turned them into cloth. And instead of maybe needing 10,000 people to make enough thread and cloth by hand, to make the same amount, you'd only need 50 people to keep the machines running, because the machines really did almost all of the work. Actually, they did do all of the work. The people that were there were just making sure that they continued to run and solve any problems. So as you can imagine, needing only that many people would cause a problem for the 9,950 who didn't have jobs, right? So yes, it did cause a problem. They had to find some new jobs. Some learned to build these machines and factories, and so they found jobs building the factories and the machines to make the cloth. One of the things also was that because the cloth was so easy to make, it was a lot cheaper. So remember, when we've talked about spices before, when something's really rare, it can cost a lot and you pay a lot of money for it. And cloth, because it took so long to make before, was a little bit like that. So now there was so much of it, and a lot of people could afford to buy a lot of cloth where they maybe wouldn't before. So a lot of different trade increased. People got jobs building or driving wagons or ships that moved all that cloth. Some people got jobs as merchants selling it, and Britain sold the cloth all over the world and became very prosperous because of their new inventions and industriousness. So other countries, this reminds me, so somebody had said something earlier about the man memorizing the plans and bringing them to America, and we're going to talk about him right now. His name is Sam Slater. So other countries were very jealous of Britain having all these machines and all this technology, being able to make the cloth easily and fast and making this money. So other countries wanted to know how they were doing it, but Britain wanted to keep their inventions secret. And it's why they were making so much money, because they had these inventions. So they actually made a law that made it against the law to sell plans to make them. So if an American came to a British factory owner and said, I want to know how you made this machine, please sell the plan to me, they actually couldn't. But in 1789, there was an Englishman named Sam Slater who worked on the machines in England. He memorized the plans, so he put it all in his head, which I can't imagine how he did that, moved to America, and he built factories of his own using that information that he had memorized. And that's how the Industrial Revolution traveled across the ocean to America. Isha, what was the name of the final machine again? It was called the Power Loom. And why would other people want to steal it? I'm not sure that they wanted to steal it, but they wanted to be able to take advantage of it as well. And because they didn't share their knowledge, which is okay, you know, it was theirs, they developed it. People got sort of desperate and wanted to have it. So he came to America, Sam Slater, and he brought that to America. And I'm assuming he either sold the plans or he shared them with other Americans, because after that, many more factories grew up. So with more people seeing how these machines worked, many more improvements were made to the steam engine, and new inventions kept coming. And they actually came up with some new ways to use the steam engine. One of the ways was to power boats. So before, you had to row, which would be very tiresome. But then they had steamboats or steamships. And so these steam engines spun big paddle wheels to push the boat forward. Now these goods could move up the river faster, or even across oceans. So you guys can see in this picture, You can see the steam coming out of the top of the little chimneys, but under that big sort of white ovalish thing is a wheel that's being moved by steam, which is pushing the boat forward. Paige, I'm sure Britain did find out about what he did and got mad, but I don't think there was anything they could do about it. So inventing was very popular at that time, Caroline. A lot of people were trying to figure out how to make work faster and easier. They did use water, Isis, I'm sure, to boil the, they'd maybe put in wood or coal and use that to create the boiling water, which then would use the steam. So right after that, right after they invented the steamships, around 1803, people started putting Watt's steam engine on wheels and they invented trains. So the trains you see in old movies are all run by steam. They're steam engines. So they would put coal or wood into the burner and that would boil the water and the steam would move the wheels. So that was actually really great because then they could use the ships as far as they had water, and then they could put the things on the trains and use the trains to transport them the rest of the way. They didn't actually have to find a passage using only water. I think originally they were small. That is probably an exhibition one, like to show people what it's like, and then they became big, huge ones. So James Watt, he died in 1819 and he was 83 years old. He lived long enough to see his inventions and the inventions of many others during the beginning of the Revolution bring much greater prosperity to countries like England and America. And a lot of these ideas of industriousness, working hard, producing a lot, and prosperity that Americans enjoy today is due in large part to inventors like James Watt and many other inventors who came afterwards, who decided to invent other things to just make work easier and faster. Ethan, it's not the Golden Gate Bridge, though it does kind of look like the Golden Gate Bridge in my background. It is actually the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. So the building of the Brooklyn Bridge was another time where Americans used steam and steam power to move things, create cranes and different things like that so that they could build something big and huge. Okay, great. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me for my webinar. We're going to end off a couple of minutes early. I hope you learned a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. One of the reasons that I wanted to talk about the Industrial Revolution is because even though it started in England, when it came to America, this idea of being able to create more cloth and inventions and increasing the amount of production and industriousness in the United States sort of sets the next stage for the things we're going to talk about, continuing to expand westward, as well as things which led up to the Civil War. So I hope you guys learned something. I'm so glad that you guys could be here. If you're interested in finding out more about some of the courses that I use to create this, you can check out heronbooks.com. And thank you so much, guys, for joining me. I'm doing another one tomorrow, so if you join, I'll see you tomorrow. Okay, bye.